What is going on? The MMA podcast is back Wednesday, March 6th. Back to talk a little UFC 235 went down this past weekend. Jon Jones defending the title. Kamaru Usman in an incredible performance taking the title away from Tyron Woodley. Ben Askren beating Robbie Lawler and a bunch more, joined as usual by Sweet Pappy Jones coming in from the deserts of California. I think it was raining, but it just let up over there. What's going on, Pat?
Oh, Big Jake, we are just chilling. It is a wonderful Wednesday indeed. Light showers in the forecast this Wednesday, but all is good. We love it over here in SoCal. Nice departure from the norm, and it was a great UFC 235 little departure from the norm, as you mentioned, with Kamaru Usman defeating Tyron Woodley, unseating him from the championship ranks at 170 pounds. Dominant performance there. Lots of great action. Great to be podding with you, my man.
For sure, nice to be back. And I want to start, before we get into UFC 235, we had all of that going down, but a few days before it was announced, and we had a press conference for UFC 236, Dustin Poirier taking on Max Holloway for an interim lightweight belt, and Kelvin Gastelum taking on Israel Adesanya for an interim middleweight belt. Pat, what is the deal with all these interim belts? What? Oh, it's driving me nuts.
Oh my God, I hear you, Jake. It's become farcical at this point, really. I love having two title fights on a pay-per-view. That's fantastic. If you want to get my $65, depending on your service provider or how you're ordering, I need a couple title fights, or at least one title fight and some super high ranked, like top fives, please. Like, this needs to be the most stacked, your best of your best. The pay-per-views are still, what are they doing, about 8 a year, roundabouts 8, maybe 10. You need to have your best fucking fighters on your pay-per-view. Having interim titles on these, and these are fantastic matchups. Dustin Poirier versus Max Holloway, a rematch, years in the making. Both of these guys, older, matured, in their prime, and it's got the interim title label on it, so it just feels a little bit, I don't know, to me it almost feels like it diminishes the value of the fight itself, almost as it does with Adesanya Gastelum. I don't know how you feel about that, Jake, but it's just, these are fantastic fights, but this, I wish any of these guys were fighting for lineal championships as opposed to interim ones.
And it would mean one thing if the UFC actually treated these interim championships like interim championships should be treated, and are guaranteed next in line for the title. But then you look just at this most recent event where you have Colby Covington, the interim welterweight champion, sitting on the sideline with his belt, while Woodley takes on a new challenger who is supposedly behind him in Usman, saying he wanted this fight the whole time, and Dana pretty much admitting that the only reason Colby didn't get the shot was because he was in timeout, because he turned down the fight at a different time. I mean, just, it's all so petty and so silly, and you've heard reasonings coming from different people. I've heard fighters saying that the interim belt is a strategy to get away with not having to pay the fighters as much. It seems to me to be the same thing, just on the other side, as far as it's the UFC trying to sell wolf tickets, so to speak. You're putting this this sort of certification on a fight. This is the championship. This is for, a title, and these guys are the best. But in reality, it's not a real title. When we look back at history, we don't look at the interim champs. We don't look at Carlos Condit for instance as a true undisputed champ. I believe that might be a bad example, but there are a lot of interim champs who were only that.
No, great example.
Yeah, so it was one thing back then, because I think back when Condit was an interim champ, at least the UFC respected the system, and there were only like one or two floating interim champs. They used an interim champ. I think when Cruz got injured, there were other times, but they didn't whip it out like as often. I mean, now you probably have 5 interim champs in the fucking UFC. You you have interim belts going up here and there, where I think we just need to, and I have a whole another speech reserved about guys moving up and down weights and them doing super fights all the time. But I do actually, to look at one of these fights specifically, which I think the Adesanya Gastelum fight makes sense if Whitaker is going to be out. I don't think many people had a problem with that. But on the other side, when you look at Dustin Poirier taking on Max Holloway, the question everyone's asking, where does Tony Ferguson fit in now? Tony Ferguson, 12 wins in a row, another former interim champ who tripped over a wire and was stripped of that interim belt. Everyone wants to see him fight Habib next. It seems like I did a couple polls actually on Twitter. Overwhelmingly, I asked what fight do you want to see most in 2019. Overwhelmingly, the answer was Tony versus Nurmagomedov. So, do I think we'll see it later this year when Habib gets off suspension? I hope, but this was a perfect place, I think, to slot him in and get him prepped and put him in that position to fight Habib. So I don't know, just I like this fight. I just don't understand why you're putting a belt on it when you have Ferguson, who seems like obviously is the next in line. Who Dana, I guess it seems, he did kind of allude to the same reasoning behind Colby getting snubbed, which was Dana put him in timeout because he turned down a fight when Dana wanted him to fight. I don't know. Kind of sucks. How do you think we'll see Tony get fit into the title picture? I mean, kind of regardless of who wins between Dustin and Max, because the winner of that fight is certainly going to want to fight Habib next for the title, especially if they're given a quote-unquote interim belt, whatever the fuck that means now.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Tony, on a 12-fight winning streak, holy smokes, hasn't lost in so long, has been dominant. Here's the thing with Tony versus Habib, though. They've booked that fight 4 fucking times. Every time it has fallen through. Twice it's fallen through in the week that it's supposed to happen. I want to say the Tony Ferguson incident was even like a day or two beforehand. Like, it's nuts. That fight, how do you book that fight? It's fallen apart multiple times, every single time, due to an injury or a fucking who knows what. But we've certainly seen, as you mentioned, with the Colby Covington situation, just because you have an interim belt doesn't mean, and even Tony Ferguson's own situation, just because you have the interim belt, that doesn't mean you're going to be next to fight the champion next, necessarily, at least in today's UFC. So we could very well see Dustin Poirier versus Max Holloway fight for this interim championship, and Tony Ferguson still get the next shot at Habib. If Conor McGregor doesn't get the next shot at Habib, and then the interim belt winner, either Dustin or Max, fights Tony Ferguson next, and then they scrap it out for the interim belt while McGregor and Habib fight for the real belt, and then the winner of both of those fights fight each other. I think I could see that happening. That's probably how it's going to work out.
Well, I was hearing that that Connor was going to fight Cowboy Cerrone next, but the only hang up about them fighting, and I heard that they would be fighting in July at that International Fight Week card in Vegas. The only hang up there being that they wanted to be on the main event, them being Connor and Donald, but the UFC wanting to slot them on the co-main event because they wanted to put a championship on the main event. Which is like, come on, it's Conor versus Cowboy. Just let him be on the main event. No fan is gonna have an issue with that. I know that having a non-title fight over a title fight kind of takes a little bit of luster off, but it's fine in this case. But it is the biggest draw of all time against the most wins slash appearances slash like this is the sports version of The Rock versus Cena. This is like an all timer. I don't give a shit if there's 20 belts or 0 belts on the line. Let it be the main event. Yeah, it's just where Tony Ferguson is left is a big question mark. You do bring up the fact that I guess there would be time. You know, this fight is in April, so that would potentially leave 7 months between Max Dustin 2 and Habib coming off a suspension. And I think they'll probably do a November card in New York City. So if that winner didn't want to take 7 months off, I would love Tony to slip in there. But it seems like the norm these days, at least, are for fighters to just fight twice a year. So them wanting to take 7 months off to wait for Habib would probably be the wiser move for whoever won. Any more thoughts on either one of those fights before we recap UFC 235? It was a fun card. It lived up to it. You've had a lot of recent pay-per-views that were not that great. This one lived up to the hype.
Yeah, it absolutely did. This was definitely a pay-per-view that delivered. This is one I was very excited for. Leading up to it, 2 legitimate lineal titles on the line with a stacked with a stacked lineup from the early prelims to the ESPN prelims, and going into the pay-per-view portion. The pay-per-view portion, 2 title fights and 3 very fun fights that were meaningful to their division, exactly as a pay-per-view should have been.
Yeah, and I guess we'll start there with the prelims. Edmund Shabazian, Macy Chiasson, and Hannah Cyphers all winning their fights. Honestly, I'm not going to waste your time. So we'll move on to the ESPN prelims. Actually, 4 notable fights there, starting off with Diego Sanchez versus Mickey Gall. Man, you had the young guy talking all sorts of nonsense against the veteran Diego Sanchez. I don't know how many appearances he has now, but it's got to be up there, top 10 as far as most UFC fights. The guy admittedly lives in a separate dimension, draws power from thunderstorms, and he got it in on Saturday night at welterweight, beating Mickey Gall via second round TKO. Cody Stamann in a fun back and forth with Alejandro Perez. I think Perez had the keys to the car as far as he was controlling the pace. He was on the outside. He was kind of choosing where that fight went. But Stamann, who sort of was being... I don't want to say being marched around, but I would say Perez definitely was controlling, standing up, but Stamann, just on virtue of being more active and aggressive and landing more, wins that fight via unanimous decision. Johnny Walker, this is a guy you're going to hear about a lot in 2019. This is an early nominee for Breakout Fighter of the Year. The guy's fucking name is Johnny Walker, for one. A Brazilian guy. Ton of charisma, ton of talent, speaks fluent English, and just fights so loose. bounces around there and defeated Misha Turkunov 36 seconds in. Another early knockout for Johnny Walker. This one via flying knee and punches. And this is a guy at 205 who people are starting to talk about a lot, beating a top 10 guy. Really interesting to see. This is this is a guy that I think could be a couple fights away from a title shot. And another guy who is pretty close to a title shot, and another guy who, I'm going to go ahead and call it now. This is going to be the breakout fighter of 2019. I think he might even be holding the strap by the end of the year. Zabit Magomedsharipov. And I'm not the only guy saying that. I don't want to stand up here and make it seem like I'm going out on a limb saying that this guy is the real deal, because that is what everyone says about him. Just has next level skills, hard training, dedication, hard work, and this guy could be one of the next pound for pound greats. Zabit Magomedsharipov defeating Jeremy Stevens via unanimous decision. Which as I say, this could be an all time guy. Props to Stevens for taking one of those rounds against Zabit, who Stevens himself is for sure a surefire Hall of Famer. Fun to see an up and coming guy take on a grizzled vet, but that fight went just about the way I thought it would go. Pat, thoughts on those prelim fights before we dive into the main card?
Oh yeah, well, for me, very nice prelims on paper, and they definitely delivered. Macy Chiasson getting the first round knockout over Gina Mazzani. Edmund Shabazian getting the first round TKO over Charles Byrd. My boy Diego Sanchez taking out Mickey Gall, round 2 TKO. That was a good fight. Good little scrap there. Cody Stamann taking the UD over Alejandro Perez. Good scrap there at 135. Very fun. Johnny Walker, oh my goodness, taking out Misha Cirkunov in fantastic form. Round 1 TKO. And my boy Jeremy Stevens, dang, he did fall to Zabit. I didn't want to believe it. I picked Jeremy Stevens to take that one, but I'm riding with Jeremy. But man, yeah, Zabit, he definitely looked very good. Put on a good performance. It was definitely solid prelims.
And we click up to the main card. Pedro Munoz taking on Cody Garbrandt at bantamweight, and another tough loss for Cody, who was just a little while ago on top of the world, holding the strap, and now has lost 3 straight fights via KO in the first or second round, losing twice to TJ Dillashaw at UFC 217 and 227, now again to Pedro Munoz. And if you watch all 3 of those sequences, all of them go down just about the exact same. He's throwing these big, looping, I don't want to say Leonard Garcia-esque, but Leonard Garcia-esque punches, and just leaving himself out there to get hit, and he just gets dropped. And, I was listening, I think it was Chael Sonnen who was talking about this post-fight on ESPN. He said Cody needs to be real careful, because the one thing that won't come back is your chin. And losing 3 straight fights like this could be devastating to someone's career. I really hope we see him return to prominence, because that Cody Garbrandt, who fought Dominic Cruz at UFC 207, that was a fun fight, and it was one of the most memorable performances that I can think of back in 2016. Because this is a guy in Cruz who is known for having top-notch, and will go down for having one of the best sets of footwork and striking and knowledge and all that. His stand-up game is unreal, especially his footwork. And Cody Garbrandt was waltzing circles around him. It was incredible. And to see him go from that fight to not having a win since is kind of unreal. You know, he was on such a roll, getting a KO against Almeida, just destroying Takeya Mizugaki in less than a minute, having that sensational performance against Cruz, and then losing 3 fights kind of in the same devastating KO fashion, back to back to back. Like I said, I hope he's able to roar back, but very, very tough loss for Cody. What did you think of that fight, Pat?
Well, a fantastic show by both guys at 135. Great kickoff to the pay-per-view portion of the event. Great way to start it off. It was fireworks for as long as it lasted, and I think the part that just kind of hurts. I don't want to say I was this close to saying he Korean zombied himself, but it wasn't like at the very end of a dominant performance. So this was just the first round. It was back and forth. They were blasting each other with shots. Both guys had the other guy hurt. Cody was throwing some crazy Sagat looking tiger knees. I was like, oh shit, he was fucking looked like he was hurting him a bit with those too. But Pedro, the young Punisher Munoz, man, he came out and I knew Pedro was good. I definitely was not sleeping on him. Thought he had a chance in this one, but Jake, as you had mentioned, the Dominic Cruz version of Cody Garbrandt, I said that version of Garbrandt is showing up. Plus, you got to factor in as well T.J. Dillashaw being the guy that he lost his previous 2 fights to, another guy in the class with those 3, along with the footwork and the angles, and he definitely just as skilled. And I mean, we saw with the outcome of those 2 fights that he had with Cody. So I said, Pedro definitely very well rounded everywhere. Hadn't necessarily seen that kind of footwork and angles from him though, but this just was a firefight from the bell essentially. And it seemed like Cody was a little apprehensive at first, but then he started to get with it and he started to get after it. And he probably had the better of it leading up to that punch. He probably had Pedro closer to being put out than he was up until he got hit with that shot. And Jake, as you mentioned, he just got a bit too wild with those hooks coming in. Um, Leonard Garcia, I would say that's good. Leonard Garcia with just a little more power, perhaps. That's what I'd say. Because I mean, Cody has the power. If he's throwing those hooks. If one of those would have landed flush, for sure, there's a good chance the fight could have been ending. But did not happen that way. Pedro got in a little bit quicker, dropped him with a solid right, I believe it was, and that led to the finish. Um, Fantastic showing for Pedro. Heartbreaker for Cody. Uh, Man, makes you feel like he's still got it, but if he can just tighten some things up, not rush in, not force it, he could have had that one quite possibly. But that one went to Pedro in a great performance.
Rolling up the main card, Wei Li Zhang defeating Tisha Torres, 30-27 across the board. Not really much to say about this. I guess you can call Wei Li Zhang at this point the most successful Chinese fighter in the history of the UFC. I mean, we've seen a lot of Asian fighters, but most have come from places like Japan, South Korea. We have, I can think of a few guys from China, but none really made an impact in their division. There was Li Jiang Liang, I think, was one guy. I can't think of a lot of others. And Wei Li Jiang now, she already was in the top 10, I think. No. I think the new rankings have since come out. She now has cracked the top 10. She's 7th. So that has got to be higher than any Chinese fighter in the UFC has ever gotten to. So props to her. Coming from a nation of many where there's not a lot of representation in the UFC. With organizations like ONE UFC doing stuff, all over Asia and Singapore, the Philippines, China. It'll be really cool to see more countries jumping in and getting interested in MMA. I mean, you look at some places like like uh, Brazil and Australia, where MMA has really kind of taken hold. Thoughts on that fight? I can't really, you know, it was just about what I described, a one-sided decision.
No, it definitely was. Wiley, she definitely surprised me with that one. I knew she was definitely a solid prospect going into that. She'd been impressive in her fights leading up to her bout with Tisha Torres last Saturday. But Tisha, veteran of the game, looked like she's still been improving, and I thought she would be able to get this one done against Zhang. But yeah, Wiley was crafty in this one. She got it done everywhere, and definitely a very very solid, well earned decision. And yeah, definitely very good for China. Nice to see them have a really solid prospect. I mean, cracking into ranked territory here in the UFC. Very good to see, and I'm excited to see how she does moving forward.
And her moving up to seventh, the only women between her and the champ Rose, you have Andrade, who is about to fight Rose, and then the only five women between the top and Zhang are Ioana and Jacek, Nina Ansaroff, Tatiana Suarez, and Claudia Gadelia. So there's a lot of opportunities. Oh yeah, and one more, Carolina Kovalkovich. Um, a lot of interesting opportunities as she climbs up that ladder. Um, the fight a lot of folks were talking about when it was all over, that match between Ben Askren and Robbie Lawler. What a roller coaster. I mean, it starts off, and not even 10 seconds into the match, Robbie Lawler is throwing an F5 on Ben Askren, throwing him down on his head. For a second, it looked like he could have been out. I mean, landing some brutal ground and pound. He had Ben's hand trapped, so he was just landing a ton of unanswered shots flush to the side of Ben's head. Ben, luckily, as Herb was stepping in to see if Ben was all right, Ben was able to scramble out of there, stand it back up, showed a tremendous amount of heart, and eventually was able to grab Ruthless and do what he does, which is work that slow orthodox funky style. Ended up taking us back for a moment into securing a bulldog choke, and in what was a really controversial ending sequence, Robbie's right arm, which was up defending the choke, just drops, and it appears to drop limp to the ground. Herb reaches in to check if he's all right, but then, pardon me, Robbie apparently seems to lift his hand, and there's a bit of confusion, and there still is. And I think the only one who really knows the answer to this is Lawler himself. But whether he was out for a moment or not out at all, or what, the fight gets stopped, and Askren wins the fight via technical submission, bulldog choke, 3 minutes and 20 seconds into the first round. Before we talk about what's next for either guy, what did you make of the fight? That I don't know if you want to call it an F5 or an attitude adjustment or what, but it looked like a move straight out of pro wrestling in the start to the controversial finish. What were your thoughts on all that, Pat?
Oh my God, Jake, this fucking match. First of all, it was definitely more pro wrestling than it was NCAA D1 matchup. This was this was definitely an F5, an RKO, something friggin' a Frankensteiner. I don't know what the hell this was. Robbie Lawler just decided to throw Ben Askren First of all, when's the last time we've ever seen anyone do anything like that to Ben Askren as far as grappling is concerned? I thought he might have been out from that throw as well. And Robbie decides to hit him with some bombs. If Ben were a rock'em sock'em robot, bless his heart, we love Ben. Ben is a good friend to the podcast. But damn it, that head would have popped off of that robot. Our boy was getting trucked. It wasn't looking so good, but
That was one of the most impressive versions of Robbie Lawler I think we've ever seen.
no, coming into that fight, Robbie Lawler was looking ripped. He was definitely looking like one of the best versions of himself. Looked like he'd really been training up and looking sharp going into that one. But I mean, and he was hammering our boy Ben. But I'm 18-0, undefeated, now 19-0, was able to manage to get through unscathed, or well, managed to get his wits about him anyways, enough to get the dominant grappling position, establish that bulldog choke, which again, more WWE pro wrestling type of stuff. He's basically got him in a headlock and submits him with the fucking headlock. Now, at the time, as I was watching this fight, I noticed the arm go limp live. And I was like, oh shit. But then I did also happen to notice the fact that when Herb stepped in to stop the fight, Robbie Lawler immediately jumped up and was like, what's going on? What are you doing? So I was like, oh, that's not good. Of course, replay, we can see all the details, things like that. Herb Dean, who knows? He's got the best angle. He's supposed to be able to see all this action. He is the one who lifted up Robbie's hand, which did not actually fall. Again, this was pure WWE. Holy fuck, was this match scripted? Was this a work? Rest in peace, Ramses. We love you. This fucking fight, he lifts up Robbie Lawler's hand to see if he's fucking asleep, just like a wrestling match. But his hand in the replay, we see, does not hit the ground. It kind of comes back up. But Herb was already waving off the fight before that. It's like someone who knocks on a door and doesn't wait for the answer. They just open the fucking door.
That's a perfect example.
That's 100% what this was. And I mean, hey, we all make mistakes. I mean, this is a little bit different. I mean, sometimes entering the wrong door can be a high stakes situation, but yeah, he is in the cage to be in the best position to know whether or not to stop this fight. But I don't know, the arm went limp. I could see how it could happen at the moment, but if you're raising dude's arm, look at the fucking arm to see what happens afterwards.
And I think Herb lives in a universe where when an arm drops like that, 96 times out of 100, when you go to lift that arm up, the arm's gonna drop. Because that was just, I do agree.
True.
I agree with the consensus that he was probably not out because of him standing up. I mean, I know Lawler's a beast and everything, but if he really was out, he would not have been able to protest as clearly and as swiftly as he did. So, I don't want to argue that he was out, but it's just the way, your natural reaction when you're getting choked like that is to fight the choke. So to see an arm not only move downward, but to kind of just like let go and let the arm drop and let kind of your knuckles hit the ground, that looks like you're out. And you couldn't tell at all if he was or not. So Herb lives in a universe where 96 times out of 100, when you knock, someone goes, come in, and that's, when you lift up the arm, it falls, and you wave off the fight. And, yeah, that, when, I think he probably, as he was stepping in and called it, was like, oh, fuck, and, wished in that moment you could pull it back. But dude, when you're an MMA ref and you have to make calls on the fly like that, that's gonna be that's human error. It sucks, but that's going to happen in this sport. So I don't know. I would rather see a fight called off a little too early rather than a little too late. But honestly, even if the fight was not stopped there, there was still a minute 40 left, and Ben had a pretty good position on Robbie Lawler. And Ben has got a squeeze where, I mean, I don't know if you've seen, but he hugs a watermelon and pops it. The dude's got a very, very, very tight squeeze when it comes to that groundwork. And I think if he even had 40 seconds, not just a minute 40, he would have found another way to finish the fight. So, there was talk of a rematch. I think Dana said he really wanted them to run it back. Ben said he was not interested in that at all. I don't want to see a rematch. Both guys are in their mid-30s. They both are coming off over a year layoff. If the circumstances were different, then I could perhaps see it. But I think it's time we get both guys on with their career, especially because this is Ben's debut. You don't want to wrap him up in this long time rivalry against a fighter that it really makes no sense to tie them up against. Ben is going to be a guest fighter in London. I do think it makes a lot of sense to match Ben up with the winner of Darren Till versus Jorge Masvidal. Not only does that stylistically bode very well for Ben, but it could make sense as far as a title eliminator after Covington apparently will fight Usman next. What do you think is next for Ben Askren moving forward? Do you like the idea of a rematch?
I do like the idea of a rematch, Jake. I hate to say it. I know
Ooh.
both guys, as you mentioned, are getting up in the 30s, but both in great shape. Ben Askren specifically, he's got very little mileage on him as far as the fights he's been in. That was the most damage, probably cumulatively. He probably took more in the one round he fought with Robbie Lawler than he did in his whole career, honestly. I mean, he's been in some fights for sure, but with the way Robbie Lawler was taking it to him, that was big. I know Ben, technically, he got the finish, and if you believe the Gracie brothers breakdown, that given a couple more seconds, it probably could have ended up in a legit technical submission. But who knows? There's that X factor. Point is, it was not finished when the referee came in and stepped in to intervene. So I would not mind at all seeing them run that one back. There's certainly, I don't think that either Ben or Robbie has done enough. Ben with this win, although maybe one more fight, just given the way that this one went down. If he would have came down and just taken Robbie Lawler out in, just a minute or two, taking minimal damage and, looked super stealth with the submission coming through, that might have been a whole different story. I'd say, hey, the man's undefeated. Look what he did to Robbie. Give him a title shot. But it wasn't exactly clean like that. I think give him maybe one more fight if it's not the immediate rematch. And then I could potentially see him in the title picture. I mean, we're talking about the former Bellator welterweight champion, former One Fighting Championship welterweight champion. He's certainly got the credentials. I don't think he needs to pile up too many in a row to get that title fight. And as for Robbie, I'm just sure he would love that one back. I'm sure he'd love to prove that he wasn't out and that he could continue to do well against Askren.
I think we got Leon Edwards versus Gunny Nelson on the co-main event of that same London card. I wouldn't mind seeing the winner of that co-mainer fight, Robbie Lawler, next. It'd be a nice step up. I was thinking.
Oh yeah.
I was thinking at first maybe Ponzinibbio Lawler would make sense, but then I forgot. Duh, bro, they're teammates. They both trained down in Coconut Creek together at ATT. What a killer team they got down there at American Top Team in Coconut Creek, Florida. Bunch of killers. Moving on to the co-main event. Man, what a wild fight here between Kamaru Usman, Tyron Woodley. Not wild in the sense that I don't think there were any standout moments, and a lot of fans, in fact, were booing, saying it was boring. The fight going 50-44, 50-44, 50-45. I don't think anyone expected such a dominant performance against a guy who was being talked about. You know, if he were to win this fight, Woodley would be up there as one of the greatest welterweight champs of all time. You know, coming off a dominant performance against Darren Till, where I think it's the first time ever in a title fight where a fighter has landed 0 significant strikes, back to back, just super incredible performances against Thompson. Just had put so many wins together, and you had a young guy in Usman coming up. You know, my friend Alan even saying this fight went to a decision. There was absolutely no way it was going to be Usman. That it would for sure be Woodley winning the fight. I think a lot of people were in the same boat, thinking that he had the advantage pretty much everywhere. And like I said, he didn't just win this fight; he won the fight definitively, 50-44 on 2 of the judges' scorecards. Man, what did you make of this fight between Usman and now former champ Tyron Woodley?
Well, this was an incredible performance from Kamaru Usman. Definitely the highlight of his career. Definitely one of the best performances I've seen from him, coming out and dominating the champion who has taken it to so many people. Tyron has beaten some of the world's best incredibly convincingly. Robbie Lawler, he destroyed Robbie Lawler in 1 round. Hardly took him any time at all. He blasted Robbie like it was nobody's business. Took that belt clean, and he'd just been roughing everybody up at 170 pounds ever since. But Kamaru coming out the way he did, and he just showed the Kane level of cardio, just that endless 25 hard minutes. He was putting in some very hard minutes there. Some of those body shots he was delivering to Tyron, I said, I don't know how every rib on the left side of his body's not broken right now. It was just hammers to the body. He was beating him up everywhere. It was a very long night at the office for Tyron. But, man, it was a very impressive one for Kamaru, new 170-pound champion. I thought Tyron was going to get it done myself. I thought the hands were heavier, and I think that they are. But he was not able to implement them against Kamaru. And Kamaru was just able to use the length, able to use the height and reach advantage, able to put the pressure on Woodley, able to make him carry him, wear him down. It was an expert, a championship level performance from Kamaru. Very, very well done.
And you heard Woodley in a lot of post-fight interviews saying that, you know, the extracurricular activities weren't taking away from his training, but you know, it was. I saw a couple of clips of his Instagram videos he put up, and the guys in his car like, yeah, you know, just getting back from TMZ. We got Family Feud tomorrow. Then I'm going to be in the studio. We got the album dropping next week. I got to go back on TMC the next day. And then I got this movie. We're doing film for, you know, we're doing this and that. And it's like, man, you know, and he said when you know, he dropped the belt, like, yeah, you know, you only can train so much every day, and it isn't like I'm just gonna sit at home and stare at the wall. And he is right to an extent, but at the same time, you know, when you're off doing all of that stuff and you do lose a fight, that's kind of an untenable position to be like, oh yeah, all of these other side ventures that I'm in and I'm still involved with, I should have never gotten involved with, and I wish I hadn't gotten involved with them. Like, you can't really say that about the album the day it drops. So, you know, he's in a spot where he still has a brand to sell. And honestly, you know, you can't blame him for it, especially in an era where, you know, you can't count on or expect the UFC to take care of your ass, because they will throw you to the road the second they get a chance. So you unfortunately have to follow the Brendan Schaub / Conor McGregor route of turning yourself into something more than a fighter, more than the UFC has sort of control over, which Woodley has done a good job of doing, but at the same time, now that he doesn't have the belt, he used to have a lot of leverage over the UFC, and it's not a a secret that Dana and Woodley aren't necessarily the best of friends. And now that Woodley has lost this leverage of having a belt and being a champion, it's going to be a long road to try and get back to earning himself a title fight. But yeah, it looks like Usman Covington next. Rest in peace, Colby. Thoughts?
Oh yeah, yeah. Kamaru and Colby. That looks like it's going to be next, and I would be willing to bet too that they're gonna book it as a title unifier. The undisputed or the interim champ versus the undisputed champ. I hope that they do that. That would just be comedy gold. But yeah, I always thought that Kamaru would probably have the upper hand if those two fought, but especially after the fight I saw on Saturday night, I don't know. I don't know how Colby weathers that storm. Colby has not looked as impressive to me as Kamaru did on Saturday night. I haven't seen that kind of fire from Colby. Not yet. He would have to shock me just like Kamaru did if that fight is made. I think that's very likely going to be the next one. I mean, they've already got video of them having the scuffle the day after the fight. It looks like they're already working on building this thing up. So definitely looks very likely. I hope Colby gets paid nicely, but I'm definitely leaning Kamaru in that one.
And yeah, I am as well. And in your main event on UFC 235, potentially, I'm not sure. I haven't gone back and looked, but this might hold the UFC record for the most two generic names ever to be fighting for a championship. Jon Jones taking on Anthony Smith. I can't think of anything that beats it. But like I was saying to a few people before the fight, there's three things guaranteed in life, and that's death, taxes, and Jon Jones fucking up anybody you put in front of him at heavyweight. And he stepped in there again and did what he does. Would have been a 50-44 across the board had Jon Jones not need Smith in the head when he was down toward the end of the fight. And big ups to Smith for not being the kind of guy who would fake an injury and go for a DQ. Just a warrior of a fighter, but obviously couldn't piece together what he had to against Jon Jones. Talked about in the post-fight interview about just sort of not being able to pull the trigger, and that's what Jon Jones does very well. Kind of neutralizes his opponents with his size, decides where the fight goes. We're looking at one of the greatest talents in the history of the sport. It's wild to see him just dominate fighter after fighter, and Anthony Smith was no exception.
He certainly was not. And to Anthony Smith's credit, I thought he started out a little bit better than I perhaps thought he would. Did not realize Anthony Smith and Jon Jones were very alike in stature. And I have contended at points that I think a lot of Jon Jones' success does stem from his unique build, his height, and his reach. Just the way his body's built, the way he's able to use it. He's a different opponent than most other people at the light heavyweight division. And coming up against a guy his size and Anthony Smith, I thought Smith did fairly well for himself, at least much better than a lot of other guys do. Most guys, it's just literally a pillar to post beating. Man, that kind of is what it devolved into. But at least it wasn't that way immediately. Smith got in some shots, he landed some good strikes, but ultimately, once Jones found his rhythm, he got things going. It really was a steamrolling. I was rather upset to see that knee to the head. It's like, what in the hell? That's just an egregious shot. Anthony Smith, I mean, he certainly wouldn't have had to fake an injury with that. That was a fucking shot. I mean, that wasn't like a Josh Koscheck just grazing the hair slash really doesn't even hit you, but you're whining and crying and holding your fucking face. He got hit with that fucking knee, but he decided to stay in the fight and continue to get hit a little bit more. It was or well, a whole lot bit more. Anthony Smith, man, really showing some heart, going the distance. I think just by virtue of going the distance, he did better than I and many other people might have thought. So big ups to him for taking the fight and having a showing. I mean, literally, Lyoto Machida did not take Jon Jones to the distance. Anthony Smith did. So that in and of itself is something. Although some say there are no moral victories at all, let alone in cage fighting, but he can have that one for what it's worth. Jon Jones, as you mentioned, Jake, just continuing to absolutely wreck every person that's put in front of him. Don't see any sign of that slowing down anytime soon.
No, and 2019 should be exciting because he's had his issues the last few years, and he said that this year he really wants to be active. I do think, I hope a move up to heavyweight to fight Cormier is in the cards, but I don't think it's in the immediate future. I know Cormier is recovering from an injury. I don't know if it was to his hand or what, but he should be returning soon. I would like to see Cormier get the fight against Brock Lesnar because not only would that look great on the career, record and all that, but he'd make a boat ton of cash. And as good as he's been to the UFC over the years, I think it would be very fair to give DC that fight. So Jon Jones, where he said he wants to fight a bunch this year. The name I keep hearing a ton at 205 is a man who actually beat Anthony Smith at middleweight not too long ago. Thiago Santos, looking like a beast out there, a name you've heard going back years and years in the UFC, but has pieced together some wins of recent, and I think makes the most sense as far as Jones wanting to make a run and clean out to 205 again. This is the next logical step. There's a lot of new blood in 205. I mentioned Johnny Walker. There's Dominic Reyes lurking there at 8. A few different fighters for Jon Jones to destroy before he ends up moving up to take on DC, hopefully at heavyweight in a trilogy. That would be very fun. But yeah, what do you like next for Jon Jones, champ of 205?
Oh boy, well for John, I could definitely see Thiago Santos. He's catapulted himself into the rankings very handily. He's definitely on a good streak there, finishing people, looking tough. I could very easily see that one going down. He's got the 4-fight win streak. I would say very logical, either him or Corey Anderson. Corey Anderson and Jon Jones, they've been jawing back and forth a little bit. Corey has a 3-fight win streak going on right now, ranked number 7 in the light heavyweight division. I could definitely see that one being a fight to be made. Corey's been looking much improved as of late, if I do say so myself. Just my observation. Looks like he's really starting to put things together, and I think he could definitely be, if not the next person, maybe next after Thiago Santos.
Yeah, and shoot, man, I think that wraps up UFC 235. Like I said, it was a fun one. It lived up to all the hype. Anything else? I think I had it in front of me a second ago. I think the fight of the night bonus went to Pedro Munoz and Cody Garbrandt. Yeah, your performance of the nights. Johnny Walker and Diego Sanchez. Walker dislocating his shoulder, doing the worm in celebration when the fight was all over. Um, I guess you got nothing else. We have one last bit of news. Jose Aldo set for a featherweight belt against Alexander Volkanovski at UFC 237. That is going to be a fun fight. And usually when it's the up-and-coming guy against the grizzled vet, I like to go with the prospect. But, man, I just, as much as I respect the skill set and think that he could very well hold UFC gold in the very near future, I'm taking Jose Aldo here. What about you?
Yeah, for me, I mean, it's hard to pick against Jose. He is absolutely one of the premier fighters at 145 pounds, one of the best who have ever done it. And I mean, I always say he's a pound for pound great in my book, just by virtue of his wins over Frankie Edgar and BJ Penn, two guys who were both champions at 155 pounds in the UFC, and he put in work against the both of them. I mean, Jose Aldo, truly one of the best to do it in the sport. I'm leaning with him early, but dang, I mean, I almost feel like this is my Jeremy Stevens versus Zabit uh, pick here, where I'm kind of picking with my heart. I could really see the young, hungry lion getting this one, but I'm like, no, I'm gonna go with the vet. But in this case, the vet is absolutely one of the greatest 145 pounders to ever do it. So I'm riding with Aldo early in this one, but man, Volkanovski is a beast. Definitely, uh, definitely has some championship caliber potential.
You said it, brother. And like I said, we are back, and we will be back a little later this week. We got a fun fight this Saturday in Wichita. Storm's going to be brewing up at heavyweight between Derek Lewis and Junior Dos Santos at the Intrust Bank Arena. Some other fun fights. Tim Means, the Dirty Bird, taking on Nico Price. That will be fun. A bunch of fights going down
Woo!
on ESPN Plus. Maybe some news to break down as well. Pat, anything for the people before we let them ponder this podcast?
Jake, you know what it is. They know what it is. It's nothing but love for the people. Always. Thank you for tuning in. Jake, glad to be back on the podcast train. Gee whiz. Can't wait to be back to break down this Saturday's card.
Sounds good to me, bro. We will do it, and we appreciate you listening. Glad to be back, and until the next episode, we gone.